a line through the gel. They are stained, showing each fragment as a dark band at a certain position relative to each other. This image forms the DNA fingerprint. If the procedure was repeated with a sample of DNA from the same person, the fingerprint would be the same. The more related two individuals are, the more similar the DNA fingerprints are. The fingerprint of a parent would show had the band at the same position as the fingerprint of their child. The adrenal gland has a core called the adrenal medulla and a superficial layer called the adrenal cortex. When an immediate perceived threat causes short-term stress, sympathetic nerve impulse from the medulla cause the adrenal medulla to secrete norepinephrine into the bloodstream, resulting in immediate sympathetic fight or flight response. In prolonged or chronic stress, the reaction is hormonal and through the bloodstream, which is much slower. The hypothalamus releases ACTHRF, activating the pituitary to produce ACTH, which stimulates the adrenal cortex to release cortisol, aldosterone, and testosterone, which collectively fight the effect of chronic stress. Clearly, the reaction to long-term or chronic stress are much slower. Since the burrowing owl and the kestrel ate many of the same types of food, they are competitors. Competition between members of different species is interspecific competition. The badger enlarged the ground squirrel hole for its own purpose, but that provide a subsequent benefit to the burrowing owl. Since the badger gains no advantage from the burrowing owl, the relationship between owl and badger is commensalism. In a commensal relationship, one organism benefits and the other is unaffected. Non-native plants and animals reduce genetic diversity by outcompeting existing populations for resource as well as introducing new disease into the communities where they were introduced, often eliminating local plants and animals, thus decreasing diversity. The establishment of natural parks, restrictions on movement of live goods, and breeding programs will attempt to preserve or increase genetic diversity. The Indian fritillary has similar wing patterns to the African monarch, which has toxins to defend it against potential predators. By imitating the toxic African monarch, the Indian fritillary is afforded the same protection against predation. Because this is a recessive trait, carriers must be heterozygous. To calculate the percentage that is heterozygous, use the Hardy-Weinberg formula. The breeding of dogs involves non-random mating. That is, the breeder selects a dog with certain desired characteristics to breed. This is a form of inbreeding that reduces genetic variety and increases the frequency of genetic defect. It is not natural selection because nature is not selecting which animals will reproduce, humans are. Geographic isolation refers to a population being separated from other populations of the same species by a physical barrier, such as a mountain range or a river. Geographic isolation by itself will not affect the frequency of genetic defect. Mutation can happen spontaneously or can be caused by something in the environment. There is no reason to assume that mutation rates will be higher in purebred dogs than in cross or wild animals. Having a high biotic potential means that it has a high reproductive capacity so that it can increase its population size quickly. Insects whose populations can explode in a short time have a high biotic potential. The Norway maple is not really on steroids, that is just a figure of speech. Having a strong root system certainly helps the tree, but this is not directly related to reproductive rate. The tree reaches sexual maturity early, which means that it will start to reproduce at a young age, and it has a large number of seeds, 2 points that succession of changes on faculty. The pioneer species is one such as moss or lichen that begins a new community where there was not one before. Serial stage species and intermediate species refer to organisms such as poplar trees that invade an area, perhaps dominating for a while, but are eventually pushed out themselves. Exponential growth is found in R-selected species such as mosquitoes and dandelions and produce a J-shaped growth curve controlled by density-independent factors such as climate. Logistic growth is found in K-selected species such as whales and wolves and produces an S-shaped curve that begins the same as the J-curve but then begins to flatten finally, leveling off as resource becomes scarce and environmental resistance rise. Eventually, the population comes to a population size N called the carrying capacity K that can be supported by the environment. Therefore, the statement that logistic growth rates fall as environmental resistance increase is correct. Reabsorption of water in the kidney tubules occurs passively as a result of the active reabsorption of sodium in the tubule. The reabsorption is influenced by aldosterone. Parathyroid hormone increases blood calcium concentration by increasing the absorption of calcium from the intestines and the release of calcium ion from bones. Multiple sclerosis, MS, a disease of the nervous system, typically has symptoms of uncontrolled muscle response, weakness, paralysis, and vision difficulties. Research believe that MS occurs as a result of the body's immune system destroying the myelin sheath that surrounds the axon of a nerve cell. The result is a scarring of brain tissue or of spinal cord tissue. Stimulation of a sensory neuron produces an action potential. An abnormal pattern in this action potential can be used to detect MS in its early stage. The graph below illustrates the membrane potential of a neuron after stimulation. Monoamine oxidase, MAO, is an enzyme that breaks down the neurotransmitters dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine. Individuals who are involved in extreme sports, such as rock climbing, generally have low levels of MAO and therefore higher than normal levels of these neurotransmitters. Dopamine and serotonin are linked to pleasurable feelings. Norepinephrine is released in the fight or flight response. One hypothesis for why individuals participate in extreme sports is that in order for individuals with high resting levels of these neurotransmitters to achieve a pleasurable sensation, they require a greater surge of these chemicals than do other people. Serotonin stimulates the release of endorphins, and endorphins eventually cause the release of more dopamine. Studies of individuals involved in extreme sports have found these people have lower than normal numbers of 2 of the 5 types of dopamine receptors. The endorphin metenkephalin is comprised of the amino acids methionine, phenylalanine, lysine, and tyrosine, plus mRNA codons for the production of metenkephalin are this series of letters. New research has led to advance in the development of male contraceptive. One of the most promising contraceptive methods involves injecting androgens, testosterone, or other male hormones into a male's muscles. The androgens produce a negative feedback effect on the hypothalamus and pituitary gland. In trials involving a combination of androgens, sperm counts were reduced to 0 in test subject, but this method was effective for only 3 weeks. Researchers developing male contraceptives have found other methods of interfering with various stages of sperm development and sperm release from the body. Some methods of contraception currently being investigated are given below. Interfering with the process of meiosis by which sperm are produced, blocking the release of hormones that stimulate the release of FSH and LH, using removable polyurethane plugs the Dion quintuplets on May 28, 1934, near Callander, Ontario, surprised the world. The quintuplets had a combined weight of 6 kilograms, and theirs was the first known case in which all members of a quintuplet yet survived. The process by which the quintuplets were formed is thought to be as diagrammed below. Most autosomal trisomies are lethal. The average survival age for infants with Patau syndrome, trisomy 13, is 6 months. Infants with Edward syndrome, trisomy 18, survive on average only 2 to 4 months. Individuals with Down syndrome, trisomy 21, can survive until